Hello everyone and welcome to this Allen & Heath webinar. My name is Nick Beretta, I'm Head of Product at Allen & Heath, and I'm joined today by Ben Morgan, our dLive Product Manager. Thank you for joining us today. If you haven't attended an Allen & Heath webinar before, a couple of things to know. There's a questions pane in your webinar interface, and you can use the questions panel throughout the webinar to send in any question you might have. So don't wait until the Q&A session at the end. We'll do our best to answer them in real time, and we'll pick up some of them at the end of the webinar. We will also get back to each and every question after the webinar. So in the next few days, you might get an email with an actual response to your questions. Now, let's start with the presentation. I just want to start with a big thank you to all of you because of what you took dLive in the last couple of years. So really, we took dLive from new kid on the block to a new staple in the touring industry. And I've got a few examples just to show you what I'm talking about. dLive is at the top of the rider for Nile Rodgers and Chic. It was used front of house and monitors on the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury, and really doesn't get much better than that in our industry. We had so many tours with dLive in these 2 years, and this last summer in particular, we had some very nice tours going on with dLive around the globe. One was Brian Ferry, here on tour with our friend engineer, Tom DeMons. And they're using dLive, and you can see in the corner of the picture an IP8 remote controller with extra faders that Tom uses to control some of the master levels in his mix. Another pick of these recent tours, Warpaint, an indie band in the US. They use dLive at both ends, front of house and monitor. And the guitarist and vocalist, Emily, she is notoriously particular about her monitors. So you can see she's been kitted out with an IP6 this time on a mic stand, which she uses to control her own personal monitor mix. dLive and V1 systems are also used on a number of shows in the West End, major orchestra shows and musicals in the West End. And if you're interested in this particular application, which is all about show control automation and integration with the Mi personal monitoring system, look out for a video about it very, very soon on our YouTube channel. Also, we reached 250 global rental partners with dLive systems. Now, these partners are major rental companies with full S-Class touring systems with touring flight cases and all of the accessories you might need for a production. And all the big names are in there, from VER to SSC, Claire, Global. They're all in our stock list, in our rental list. This is creating a demand for hundreds of engineers to get hands-on with dLive, to get training, to get certified on dLive systems. And I just want to show you an example. This is a recent training event in China with our Chris Pine delivering a training session on dLive. And I'm told that a very similar speech he gave at a university in China reached 80,000 views on a live stream event on Facebook. So that proves there's quite a lot of interest in all territories for our technologies and mixes. Now, 1.6, what's that all about? So let's talk about firmware. With 1.5, we delivered a number of features which were driven by requirements for theatre, touring, festivals. It's what we call the automation pack. 1.6 is primarily about install, and we'll see why in a few minutes. But there's also some exciting new tools and processing tools that we'll talk about, which I'm sure they are of interest to everyone. Now, the code name for 1.6 is Fistral. Fistral is possibly Britain's most famous surfing beach, just out of Newquay, on the Atlantic coast of Cornwall, and not far from Allen & Heath headquarters. So here it is, a beautiful sunset picture of Fistral Beach. And before you say anything about the waves, here is what it looks like when the conditions are good. So that's a proper big wave for surfing. And 1.6 is also very big. 1.6 is probably our biggest release yet for dLive. It's so big, actually, that for the first time, we've pinned down an actual value of $1,595. Now, don't fret, don't panic just yet. It will be available for free to all dLive registered users. And if you haven't registered online yet, there is still time to do so on our website. So that value is really just to give you an idea of the amount of tools and processing and new features that we unlock with 1.6 firmware. Now, Ben, do you want to take us through some of the key features of 1.6 before we move on to the next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nicola. Yep. Okay, what you can see on the screen first, dual surfacing. I'm just going to explain the concept to you briefly. Dual surface allows you to connect two dLive surfaces to one dLive mic track. And obviously, there are some obvious benefits to this, some obvious kind of examples where this would be useful, front of house and monitor split being the most obvious one. However, I have to say, in 1.6, we are not giving you dual surface mode, I'm afraid. What we're actually doing is we're going to go one better, and we're going to give you multi-surface. Now, multi-surface, it allows you to connect up to 4 dLive surfaces to one individual dLive mic track. As I previously mentioned, there are a number of kind of examples where this would be useful. 2 surfaces in a front of house monitor split, for instance, or in some broadcasting install applications, it may be desirable to have a number of surfaces controlling the same rack. I'm going to go through some of the kind of software, the new software features which make this possible a bit later on. But multi-surface, just to kind of recap, 4 surfaces connected to one mic track. This is going to be possible in 1.6. The other headline feature in 1.6 is AMM. If you don't know what AMM is, it's automatic microphone mixing. And it is designed for spoken word applications such as panel shows, conference rooms, TV talk shows, even government and local kind of local council use. So we've put in a powerful 64-channel AMM unit into 1.6. And again, I'm going to go through the kind of details of this shortly. Now, it doesn't stop there. What else have we added? Well, we've added a new valve-based preamp. You can see that on the right of the screen there, the tube stage. It's derived from our existing dual-stage valve preamp, but it has a simplified and more efficient control set to allow you to dial in analog kind of valve warmth and overdrive quicker than you've ever been able to do before. To complement this, we've also added a new deep compressor. You can see this at the bottom of the screen, the Mighty compressor. And this is influenced by a pretty well-known 1980s VCA compressor, which was known for its lightning-fast attack and very aggressive compression characteristics. It's not a subtle compressor. It's something you can most definitely hear when you kick this thing in. And as you can see on the screen, there's even more. Cascade mode for DX16.8. So if you're a DX16.8 owner, you can now daisy chain 2 of those units together in 1.6. We've added some new source and scene select controls for the IP1 and the other IP controllers. We've also allowed for the first time with dLive Director to have access over Internet or WAN. So you can connect your Director session to a remote dLive system over the internet. And this will be very useful for many of our kind of install customers. Noise off switch for echo effects. If you're familiar with our echo effects unit, you'll know that we painstakingly recreated the sound of an old vintage echo unit. We took the warts and all approach where we kind of emulated not only the echo characteristics, but the kind of noise and the grumbling of the machine. Not everyone wants that, so we've now given you the option to turn that off if you still want the kind of analog, kind of warm delay sound, but without the kind of hardware grumbling and mumbling. You can now do that. We've added a copy and paste function to the recall filter. This was something that was being asked for a lot on the forums after we released 1.5 with its comprehensive suite of scene management tools. We've been asked for this several times. We've been listening, so we've now given you a copy and paste feature, which I'll talk you through shortly. Staying in the scene management menu, we've also made some under the hood improvements to the code just to improve the responsiveness of the safes, the filters, just to make everything react a bit quicker, a bit more snappy, which I'm hoping will make a lot of you happy. And finally, as Nick touched on earlier, we are bringing support for a whole new wave of install hardware. DM0, DX Hub, DX Link, GPIO, and the IP1, they are all now supported by 1.6 Fistral.
Thank you, Ben. And just to pick up on this last point, some of you might be familiar already with some of these product names, DM0 and DX Hub. Some of you might not be. So at the Infocom show in June this year, we launched a new range of products and accessories and peripherals to really deepen the integration of dLive with installed sound. So what we set out to do was basically to create a distributed, integrated, scalable, accessible solution for multipurpose venues. So dLive really puts sound at the heart of environments like schools and colleges and churches, art centers, education, and more. And the way we do it is through this new range of this new wave of hardware and software features, from the IP1 wall plate controller to the X168 remote stage boxes, the DX164W, which is a wall mount version of the DX expanders for permanent installation, DX Hub, DX Link to add more I/O expansion up to many I/O points in a single dLive system, GPIO interfaces, and last but not least, the DM0 mix rack, which is the most compact dLive mix rack in our range. Basically, a mix engine in a box without any analog I/O, but with 3 I/O ports and the S-class redundancy on GigaAs and the power supplies. So if you're interested in all of these, we're going to have a webinar tomorrow, actually, specifically on the dLive solutions for the install world. So if you haven't got any news of these products yet, make sure to register for this webinar tomorrow, and we'll be very happy to discuss it in detail. And all of the information on these products is already on our website anyway, so you're very welcome to go and explore this new range of products. Now, in other news, a couple of things which we want to touch on today, not necessarily related to Firmware 1.6, but that are happening at the same time. One is we just released version 1.5 of the Windows Door Control driver. So again, if you're not familiar with Door Control, what it does normally is it takes the raw MIDI data from any of our mixers, and it will translate that MIDI data to HUI or Mackie control for use with common DAW software like Logic or Cubase, Pro Tools, and so on. Now, with version 1.5, not only we added support for dLive, but we also added a MIDI through map without translation. So that means that you can use Door Control 1.5 in through mode. For example, if you're using a Waves multi-rack system and you want scene changes on the dLive to trigger preset changes on the multi-rack software. But that's just one of many applications. Also, the Boombox. So the Boombox is from Boom Software, so the same guys who develop the Boom's MIDI translator software. And this box is a very small and affordable unit, which has 5-pin MIDI ports on it, as well as MIDI over USB, as well as MIDI over Cat5. It's a very flexible interface, and now you can use it to add 5-pin MIDI to a dLive GLD or Q mixer. There's going to be a special firmware for the BOEM box available on the BOEM software website very soon, hopefully next week. And again, so if you are into those show control applications or integrating with legacy media equipment with a dLive, you can do that now with one of these boxes. Now, Ben, over to you to go through some of the new features in detail, and we'll switch to dLive Director to show you some of the new GUI elements and features.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, we're going to kick off with multi-surface. Now, for us to make multi-surface work, there were many considerations that had to go into the design of the software and how we were going to make this kind of work as well for you, the user, as possible. And the first step really is gain tracking. So let's have a look here on the preamp page. You can see here below the trim, the trim option here, we've got a new gain tracking button. Now, just to give you a quick overview of what this gain tracking does, let's say you have two surfaces connected to one rack. One of them is the front of house surface, the other one is being used for monitors. Now, during the performance, let's say it's a rock and roll band on the stage and the microphone next to the guitar cab gets knocked, it's gone off axis, you can't get anyone on stage to come readjust it, so you just need to tweak the gain a little bit. Now, obviously, if you've got multiple surfaces connected and you've got the signal being routed to different outputs, just changing the gain could result in undesirable increases in volume elsewhere. So what we've done is when gain tracking is enabled, you can make changes to the gain and it's automatically compensated here by the trim. And it's not just the trim here which is automatically compensating. It will be the trim on any other surface connected to the rack where gain tracking is enabled. So up to 4 surfaces can all have gain tracking turned on, where they'll all dynamically track and compensate for gain changes with their trim levels. Now, it's also perfectly possible to have some surfaces with gain tracking on and others without. So you're not committed to gain tracking being a global setting. It's granular, so you can have it on or off per surface or per input socket, however best suits your requirements. And just to show you here, the actual trim window is plus and minus 24 dB. So you've actually got a 48 dB sweep of trim compensation available, which should be more than enough, I think, for most applications. So it's not just here in the preamp page with the gain tracking that we had to make some changes and improvements to the software. We also had to consider things like scenes, where you may not want all surfaces to have access to all the different scenes. So we've come up with what we are calling roles, and you can access that via the setup menu when you're on the scenes page. And in your scenes option, scene options dialog box, you have a roles menu here. Now, up to 4 roles are available. I've got a couple here which have already been labeled, front of house and monitor. So what I can do, let me sort of take front of house for a moment. I can actually allocate a set number of scenes to the front of house role. So let's just say I'm going to allocate it, I don't know, 36. So in my scene menu here, you can see now, while I'm running the front of house surface, I have access up to scene 36, and higher scenes are locked out to me. Now, accordingly, for instance, the monitor guy or girl, they can have their monitor range starting, well, an arbitrary figure, let's say 68, and that could be going up to any figure you like. And again, this gives the monitor engineer a defined range of scenes. So this is a very kind of valuable tool because it allows you to lock down ranges of scenes for each surface which is being used. And that can just prevent all kinds of things. It can prevent one engineer overwriting another engineer's scene. And it also means when you recall scenes that each engineer is only going to recall scenes which are pertinent to the role they are playing, i.e. front of house, monitor, broadcaster, recording. Now, the role options here, it doesn't end with the scene allocation. We've also introduced up here in the top right, role saves. Now, the user interface is obviously quite familiar for this role saves. It's similar to the global saves and the recall filters. Now, what the role save is it's essentially another layer of saves or filtering, which sits in line with your global saves and your recall filters. However, the role saves are specific to each role. So a very kind of quick and dirty example. Let's say you got a front of house monitor split. We're going to say the front of house guy has access to the first 60 or so channels. We can then block the front of house engineer from any of the changes or anything that affects channels above 60. And it goes without saying that then you could do the inverse with the other role. Oh, you have to excuse me there. I've clicked on the wrong. So, as you can see, it's quite a powerful, an additional layer of powerful filtering, which means that you can very kind of easily lock out one engineer or one surface from kind of making changes to other buses or inputs that they shouldn't be concerned with. So that's your kind of obvious example there. The other thing would be your monitor engineer. Rule of thumb, your monitor engineer is going to want access to all of the auxiliary buses. That may not be a consideration for the front of house guy. He may not need any auxiliaries. And the other way round, the monitor guy, he doesn't need to worry about the LR. But the front of house guy, obviously, he needs full access to that. So again, from the monitor position, you can block LR settings and vice versa, just again to ensure that there are no kind of undesirable changes made to any buses or input channels which the surface doesn't need to be concerned with. So you can see there a kind of pair of very powerful role-based scene tools. There's another part of this jigsaw, and that's here on the show page. So again, hitting the setup button brings up this new option here, allow surface only recall. Now, to give a kind of quick description of what the purpose of this is. If you've got a dLive system with multiple surfaces and a single rack, the kind of workflow would be that each engineer, the front of house engineer, the monitor engineer, the broadcast guy, they would all save their own shows. And the reason being is that the show that is saved contains the surface settings based on the surface which is storing the show. So you would have each surface storing their own show. Now, when it comes to recalling that information, quite often you may not want to recall the mix rack information because the mix rack information is common to all of the surfaces. Now, just to give you an example, let's say you've got two engineers, front of house and monitor. The monitor engineer turns up to the show. They decide they need to add another auxiliary bus for the performance that night. So he or she goes ahead, configures the bus, adds it to the system, and then the other engineer comes along 10 minutes later, blissfully unaware of what's just happened, and loads the show up and wipes out the setting changes made by the first engineer. So obviously that's not desirable, that's not good. So what we've given you here is the ability to only recall the settings which are relevant to the surface. So let's just see what that does in practice. I'm going to recall the show here. Straight away, you can see this new dialog box. gives me a couple of options just to recall mix rack and surface or surface only options. So depending on whether you're kind of like the primary surface or one of the secondary surfaces, you would choose one of these options depending on what's most suitable for the kind of workflow and the setup that you have for that performance. So that's a bit of an overview of the multi-surface functionality we've introduced in 1.6. Now, the other big feature, AMM. So you can find that in the mix track audio menu, and AMM's got its own tab here. So you may have seen this GUI before if you've used any of our GLD mixers. It will be quite a familiar interface. If you haven't, it's essentially quite a simple setup. I should just say that the 1.6 firmware reference guide will go into a lot more detail about AMM, what it is and how it works. So if you want kind of an exhaustive overview, dig out the firmware reference guide. But I'll just give you a bit of an overview here. So this is the screen where you assign channels to the AMM. Now, here you'll notice I've got an option which is called number of AMMs. So we're actually giving you 3 different choices for AMMs, in as much as you can have one AMM with 64 inputs. You can have 2 AMMs, both with 32 inputs, or you can have 4 AMMs, each one with 16 inputs. So I'm just going to go down to 2 just for the ease of this demonstration. Now, AMM1, let's just clear that a moment. So we're just going to say we're working in a conference scenario here. We've got 2 conference rooms, and we're using inputs 1 to 16 in conference room 1. So with the block select here, I can just select a block of channels and drag them down. And there you go. Those 16 channels are now in AMM1. So AMM2, let's say, for argument's sake, they're coming off an expander somewhere, and they're coming in on input 65 to 80. Let's just drag them in there. And again, very quick, very easy. I've got my 2 AMMs set up, 16 channels each. Back here now, excuse me, you can see we have 2 discrete, separate AMM units. Now, the options which are available depend on the mode that you are running. And there are 2 modes available, NOM and D Classic. Now, D Classic is based on a classic, well-known hardware auto mic mixer, which has been around for probably over 30 years now. And it utilizes something called dynamic gain sharing, where a certain amount of gain is shared between channels, and depending on whether there's input or not, the gain will go up on certain channels and down on others. So your options here are quite simple, really. You've got on or off for the channels, then you've got a priority level. So certain channels can be given a higher or lower priority. So if it was a company board meeting, for instance, you may want the MD or the CEO. They're probably going to want their voice to be heard over everyone else. That's usually the case. So you can dial in a priority here in decibels, which will give a microphone or a number of microphones a priority over the others. Now, we also offer you NOM mode, which is number of open microphones, and this is derived from our IDR4 and IDR8 install processors. And I think it's fair to say it's a bit more of a sophisticated, more sophisticated solution with a few more options, and it may work better for some scenarios. And we'll just have a look at what the additional functionality here. So you've got off attenuation, so a bit like a noise gate, actually, in a way, that you don't have to necessarily attenuate any kind of closed mics completely. They can be attenuated by a certain value. Hold time also. So if a microphone opens, you can just force the channel to remain open for a number of seconds. And we've got other settings here for non-attenuation in the chair settings. Now the chair settings, going back to what I was talking about, in some scenarios you'll have like a CEO or MD at a board meeting or a presenter on a panel show, and their voice needs to be heard over all the other voices. With our NOM algorithm, we allow you to select one or more chair people. And because we've got two AMMs working here, you can, of course, have different chair people in each AMM zone. Now, we've also got a best mic setting. And again, there's one of those for each AMM. Now, again, for more information on how that works in depth, refer to the firmware reference guide. But best mic is useful if all the microphones are being used are the same make, the same model, similar gain settings. So, i.e., they're all kind of performing to a very, very kind of equal level. The best mic just ensures that the strongest microphone signal is used for any voice which is heard. And that helps with the legibility. It brings down, obviously, the other signals, and it also prevents comb filtering, phase distortion, and other things which can make the voice harder to understand. So quite a comprehensive set of features here. And this is something we really envisage being, very, very useful for guys looking to put this into conference rooms, TV studios, government and local council buildings where you have kind of large meetings with a number of people all talking over each other. Any environment where there are multiple microphones and the material is spoken word, the AMM is definitely something you should check out. So, back to the channel view here. So, you may recall I mentioned something earlier, and that was the tube stage preamp. So, you can see here it comes up in the same kind of GUI element that the dual stage valve preamp comes up. And you can see it's got quite a few options, but not as many knobs to play with as the dual stage valve. But that really is the strength of the tube stage. It's simplified, and it's just kind of there to help you kind of dial in those kind of vintage valve sounds quicker than you've been able to before. So very, very kind of crudely speaking, this dial here, it selects a number of different valve topologies. But as a rule of thumb, as you move clockwise around the dial, the kind of amount of distortion or the amount of warmth which goes into drive, which goes into distortion, that is kind of increased at each setting. So at your top setting here, your pentone setting, that's kind of great for dialing in just a bit of warmth, which, a lot of guys out there are using on, de-eyed bass guitars or de-eyed acoustic guitars, just to kind of fatten it up a little bit. At the other end of the dial, when we're down into the high drive settings, then we're really getting into some kind of, quite gnarly, nasty kind of overdrive sounds. And then, in the middle, we've got all the colors in between. And on some of these settings, the drive control actually doubles up as a bias control. So just by moving the drive control here, you're actually getting an interaction between the drive setting and the bias setting. So that's something you couldn't do on the dual stage valve very, very easily or quickly. On this, you can just grab this drive control, move it around, and it automatically moves the drive and bias settings around, which again, it should allow you to dial in the warmth or the drive settings that you're trying to achieve. You should be able to do that much quicker than you've ever been able to before. So let's move along the top here. Let's go to the compressor. And now, here in the list, we have the Mighty compressor. This is, as I kind of inferred earlier, this is based on a very popular, well-known studio compressor from I believe it's from the early 1980s. Now, this isn't a transparent compressor. This isn't the kind of compressor that you'd use to master something, or just to give a little bit of glue, as they say. This is really about getting a sound which smacks you right in the face. The attack is lightning quick on it, really, really quick. There's a peak and average detector switch here. Now that gives you two slightly different flavors, obviously based on whether it's a peak or average stroke RMS sensor. So it kind of grabs, depending on what setting you're in, it kind of grabs the audio in a slightly different way. Both settings are aggressive, so it's not a kind of subtle or non-subtle switch. It's really not subtle in any configuration. It really is an aggressive sounding unit. Now, you've just got some very basic controls. You don't really need much more than this, to be honest. You've got the threshold, which you're all used to with compressors, and the release and the output. Now, obviously, people will find their own uses for this, of which there are many, but a good starting point if you want to have a play around with this, snare drum, kick and snare subgroups, drum subgroups without the overheads, maybe some kind of quite aggressive picked bass guitar. All those kind of somewhat percussive sounds, they can benefit, depending on application, from the kind of really aggressive compression that the Mighty gives you. So I think you're going to have a lot of fun playing around with Mighty. It really is. It's really great fun to play. It is so aggressive, so much character. It's just fantastic. Now, just a couple of other things to add. I mentioned earlier that Director can now connect to a dLive system over the internet or over a WAN. So what you need to do that, the actual procedure is not that difficult, but you do need to know the IP address, your WAN IP address, i.e. the IP address broadcast to the outside world by the network where the dLive hardware is installed. Now, you may have to open a couple of firewall ports. This is all kind of documented, so you'll have all this information shortly, but you would open the firewall ports, and then here in Director, it'd just be a case of typing in the IP address for the system that you're trying to connect to. And then you hit connect. Again, you have all the same kind of options you do when you've got like a local connection, so you can pull or push. But you can just connect over the internet, which, again, for installers, maybe some commercial audio applications, it means you can go in, you can make scene recalls, you can reset to a default setting, you can load a show without having to go on site. You can just do that from the comfort of your own home or office. So again, I think quite a useful tool for your installers out there. Talking of install, which Nick picked up on earlier, there's a number of kind of pieces of hardware which are now supported by 1.6, and that will be talked about in more detail tomorrow at the webinar. So there's only really one thing else I want to show you now, which is the recall filter copy and paste function. Now, this might not seem like a biggie, but we introduced, 1.5 has a kind of wave of new scene management options. And one of the things it brought up was that people then, loved the scene options, but they wanted to kind of apply recall filters to multiple scenes, which we didn't have the mechanism for previously. But now it's pretty simple. So let's just go in. I'm just going to make a recall filter block all on the inputs there. Quite simple. And I want to copy and paste or kind of propagate that filter to a range of scenes. Now, it really is just a case of pressing copy filter to here. And now you can see I've got my options. I can send that to all scenes, no scenes, or a range of scenes, or I can just select by hand the scenes that I want to apply that to. And then you hit apply, and then the recall filter is applied to any of those scenes. So hopefully that's going to make you guys out there who are using the recall filter I hope this is going to make your life a lot easier. It's going to improve your workflow and free up time for you to do other things. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand back to Nick and have a look at what questions
The questions, yeah, it's questions time. We had a few coming in through the webinar. A lot of them are really questions on how to, or we have a couple of sales questions and support questions. On all of these, we will, I tried to answer a few of them now, but we will get back to you guys with contacts to service departments or sales area managers and so on. But there are a few which are on 1.6 and this webinar. A few people are asking if we will make the recording available of this webinar. And yes, we will make it available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So if you didn't manage to grab all of the webinar, or you want to watch it again and go through the features again, it will be available. Now, a few questions on the tube stage preamp, on what particular unit we emulated. And also Daniel is asking, can we have it on buses? That's a no, I'm afraid, for the time being. But I think we can consider maybe in future to have something in the effects rack which adds some harmonic distortion or coloration to the sound. But for the time being, it's only on input channels. Now, a few people are asking about gain tracking and whether it works with not just with dual surface or multi-surface systems, but with systems with multiple mix racks. Now, it's a bit of a tricky one. It wasn't gain tracking. It wasn't designed to work with systems with two mix racks or more mix racks. So it was really designed for multi-surface applications. However, while I was answering a few of these questions live, I realized that actually, if you turn gain tracking on an input channel, that will affect the trim of the very same input channel as well. And if you're sending a direct out to a second system, as opposed to the actual preamp sockets from the mix rack, that direct out will be affected by the gain compensation going on the channel. So effectively, you can send your direct outs to system B for monitors or broadcast. And if the digital trim is engaged on your input channels, those direct outs will be compensated with reference to the preamp gain. Now, someone was asking if a laptop running Director can have the same roles and can be used as a second surface, and equally, if the same applies to dLive Mixpad. Do you want to take this one, Ben?
Director, certainly that can be assigned a role. In fact, I'm using Director here for the webinar, and yes, it's perfectly possible to assign a role and, yep, assign whatever scene range or what have you. That's all perfectly possible from Director. Just one thing to point out, that Director is in essence a kind of virtual surface. Now, what we're talking about with multi-surface, when we've got four surfaces connected, that's for surfaces with audio connections. So Director itself, using Director won't eat into your kind of dual surface allowance really. The four surface limit is physical surfaces connected with PAFL buses, each with their own discrete PAFL bus, their local I/O or local analog I/O and DX I/O, I should say. They are the kind of four surfaces. Director doesn't eat into that, so you can have instances of Director running above the upper limit of four surfaces in a multi-surface system. I hope that makes sense.
Now, there's a question on multi-surface and the scene system, which we might be able to explain a bit more about. So basically, Jalen is asking, what happens with the scenes? Are the front of house and monitor engineers recalling different scenes effectively, or are they on different scenes? It's a bit more complicated than that, because part of the scene content is always in the mix rack, and part of the scene content is filtered by these new roles. So do you want to recap on how the scenes work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jaylon, it kind of depends on the application. With a kind of traditional front of house monitor split scenario, what the way we've kind of designed this is that you probably want each engineer to have their own range of scenes. So, very, very crudely speaking, let's say you've got 10 scenes for the front of house and 10 scenes for monitors, and each scene represents a song in the set. So it may be then that on song 1, the front of house engineer recalls scene 1, and the monitor engineer recalls scene 11. And then you would use the role safes up here in each scene to block out parameters which aren't relevant to that surface. So again, a kind of very kind of crude example. If you're doing a front of house monitor split, what you're probably going to want to do is you're going to want the monitor engineer to have the ability to have their own EQ on input channels. So not sharing the front of house EQ. So what you're probably going to want to do is split the input count down the middle. So dLive, as you know, gives you 128 input channels. So you split that down the middle and say, right, the front of house engineer, they have 64 channels. The monitor engineer has 64 channels, which gives them their own EQ processing routing options. And then in the role safes, you would just block out the inputs or the channels which aren't relevant to each surface. And then you would go in and then each engineer would save their scenes discreetly. So it does mean that each engineer has their own scene list. And there are benefits to this. One being that you may have, for instance, a track or I don't know, a piece of theatre or musical theatre where the front of house engineer is needing to change scenes rapidly. But the monitor engineer may not need to change as rapidly. So the monitor engineer can sit and kind of change scenes or program the scenes to kind of follow what they need to do, leaving the front of house engineer to kind of come up with their more complex scene changes or more rapid scene changes. They're completely like disconnected, so they can both do their own thing. So yes, they both do have their own scenes, and that just offers an increased amount of flexibility and power to each engineer.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And on the wider subject of scene filters, taking a step back, someone is asking, well, what actually the different scene filters or scene saves do in dLive. And just to give you a very brief explanation, basically the scene saves are global saves. In fact, they're called global saves in the tab on top of the scene manager, and those apply to every scene in your system. So any scene recall will be affected by these saves. So if you save something, that means that object, that item will not be affected by any scene recall. So you can make a channel or a setting completely isolated from the scene system, and it will stay as it is at the moment. The recall filters are a bit different because they are per scene. And actually, they work in the opposite way. So on the recall filter, you normally allow everything in a normal scene, but you can choose, if you like, to block a few parameters or a few channels. And that's, for example, if you want a scene, say, to block everything, but change only a few effects parameters or the EQ of a particular channel. And that's what that scene does, not more than that. Now, the complication is with the new roles for multi-surface, there's another layer of filters, which we call, or saves, which we call the role saves. And those are to facilitate the use of the same mix rack, the same engine and the same scenes by multiple engineers. So effectively, each engineer, each surface can have independent filters set up in the system. Now, a question on AMM, the peak off point or source point for the AMM, that's post-processing, post-delay, but pre-fade. But as Ben showed earlier, there is an option for follow fader in the settings of the AMM. So you can make the fader level contribute effectively to the signal going to the AMM algorithm. Now, with a remote connection via the internet, is there a way to PFL remotely? Unfortunately, not at the moment.
No, not yet. It would be great. Obviously, there's complications with how would that audio be piped. Would it be coming across an interface like an audio over IP protocol? It's not something we can do at the moment, but I'm sure someone out there will be very inventive and work out a way of doing it one way or another. But at the moment, it's not something that we offer as part of the firmware.
Now, a few questions are about when 1.6 will be released. So do you want to commit to any date, Ben?
No. I would hope within the next, I don't know, 2.5 weeks, hopefully. Obviously, in software environments, things are constantly being refined and tested. So there's always a little bit of fluidity there. It's very difficult to ever say, right, it's coming out at midday on Friday the 29th or something, which isn't a hint or a clue, by the way. But yeah, I would hope within the next couple of weeks we should see 1.6.
A question on the AMM again. Are stereo channels counted as a single channel on the AMM? I'm not sure you can actually have stereo channels on the AMM. I can't really think of any application where you would want them in the AMM. So I think it's only mono channels which are allowed.
I do believe that actually if you configure a channel as stereo, it won't let you drag it in to the AMM. I think it actually kind of grays it out. So it really is designed for mono inputs only.
Richard is asking if the tube stage preamp can be, so basically he's doing a tie line split for two systems, and he's asking, can I make the split channels unaffected by the tube stage? And that should be fine, because if it's a tie line, it won't be affected by any processing item on the channel. Can two surfaces connect to the same GigaAce card?
Oh, okay. It's a good question. It's something hopefully I can make a little bit clearer here. So multi-surface, what I'm going to call the primary surface, that will connect to the built-in or integrated GigaAce socket in the rack. Any additional surfaces that you want to connect will be connected to a GigaAce module, and 1.6, you would only be able to connect one surface to each GigaAce module. So you would need a GigaAce module per surface that you want to connect. Now, this obviously throws up something. S-class racks have more I/O module slots than C-class racks. So, yeah, kind of out the box, the S-class rack, you can get your full surfaces running straight off with just 3 GigaAce modules, whereas the C-class, you've only got the one I/O module slot. So you're only going to get 2 surfaces connected to the rack in that instance.
Now, there's a lot of other questions coming in. We will try and keep answering them until the hour anyway. And if we miss out on some of these, we will get back to you via email in the next few days. But Michael is asking, will there be template shows or templates for the multi-surface application, given the complexity of the feature?
Yes, absolutely. We are intending for there to be a template show, which don't know what's going to be called yet, but it'll be something along the line of dual surface split or dual surface front of house monitor. And that will just give you a basic starting point, a kind of building block to work from. I'm guessing it'll be 64 channels split between the two surfaces. So out of the box, it will probably work for most kind of generic front of house monitor applications. But for some users, they will want to tweak it a little bit. But we're giving you that kind of building block to kind of work from.
And again, does gain tracking work with double patched inputs on the same surface and rack? And yes, Jonathan, if you enable gain tracking on your input channels and if you have an internal split on your single surface and rack, you will still be able to use that feature so that any change in the analog gain, preamp gain, will basically be compensated on any input channel that you have sourced from that mix rack socket. A question from Art, again on multi-surface. I think it's a topic that will need a lot of supporting materials and videos possibly and tutorials. Art is asking, will each surface be able to access the local I/O on the of the other surface? So can you actually source from the remote surface?
Okay, just to kind of firstly go back a step, in terms of surface I/O in a multi-surface setup, the primary surface, i.e. the surface connected to the integrated GigaRay socket, the dLive system has full access to all of the analog I/O on the surface. The I/O of any DX expander connected to that surface, and also any of the I/O modules, be it Dante, Waves, MADI, any of those in the primary surface, all of those I/O are accessible by the system. With additional surfaces, so surfaces 2, 3, and 4, they still have access to the local analog I/O on the surface and the I/O of any connected DX expanders connected to the surface. What the system doesn't have access to is the any I/O modules installed in the surface. So, and the reason for that being the GigaRace link via a GigaRace card is 128 channels bidirectional. The GigaRace, the built-in GigaRace link is actually 300 channels bidirectional. So there's more bandwidth available on that built-in GigaRace socket. So, but to answer your question, all of the surfaces, all of their analog I/O and all of their DX inputs and outputs, they're all accessible into the dLive system and can be accessed from anywhere. The surface I/O modules will only be accessible from the primary surface, and they will only be the modules fitted into the primary surface itself.
Now, Ron is asking if the MixRack PFL can be assigned to a director virtual surface. And yes, that basically director works exactly like any other surface. So you can set up your preferred baffle bus or PFL bus in director. And if that's number 1, for example, that's controlling the actual headphone socket on the mix rack and baffle bus number 1, or you can switch it to 2 and then patch that PFL bus onto a couple of XLR sockets on your mix rack alternatively. So yeah, basically director is exactly like any other dLive surface in that respect. Jalen is asking about the channel split and whether that means that with 4 surfaces, for example, you only have 32 channels available to each if you want their own processing.
Yeah, well, it depends on the use. If each surface wants their own discrete processing, then yes, you're right. With 4 surfaces, each surface would have 32 discrete channels. Now, of course, that's absolutely the case for split applications. You would want that, but one other kind of application maybe we haven't talked about as much is, in some cases, people won't want that discrete processing. So, for instance, if you're working with the second surface as like a surface sidecar mixer or an extension, you won't need those kind of discrete processing channels. And you can also actually as well kind of use this as kind of like a quasi surface redundancy setup as well. So depending on your application, you may or may not need to kind of ration your input channels. But if you do need 4 surfaces, each with their own discrete processing channels, then yes, Jalen, that would give you 32 channels per surface.
Now, staying on the topic of multi-surfaces, Matt is asking about the scene system again. So are the 500 scenes split on 4 surfaces? Again, very similar to what Ben was saying. It's all customizable. It's all flexible. So you can actually leave everyone with access to the full scene range, or you can choose how the 4 different roles apply to 4 different surfaces will be limited in their access to scenes. So potentially, yeah, you can have 4 surfaces, each with a specific range of scenes within the 500 total count. Let's have a look. Can surfaces be daisy chained? Ooh.
Good question. At the moment, I believe that is not supported. My understanding is with the current software deployment, these surfaces will need to be connected to GigaRace modules in the mix rack itself. However, if that's not correct or anything changes, we'll let you know, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's correct. As in, yeah, you want an extra GigaAce card for each new surface, and the surface connects to the mix rack. Someone is asking an application question on AMM, in particular whether it would be useful for speaking parts of a play or drama. That's an interesting question. It's not the possibly not the application the AMM was designed for, but I think you might want to experiment with it, and especially if you use the gain sharing mode or the D classic mode, and you set your settings so that it's not as aggressive in terms of attenuation on the individual channels, it might be very, very useful for the application you're talking about, Nika. Ben, can you mix and match S-class and C-class surfaces in a multi-surface setup?
Yeah, absolutely. The S-class and C-class hardware, it's not just for dual surface, multi-surface, but for any application, it's all completely kind of interchangeable. You don't have to worry about any compatibility issues.
A question on mixpad used with multi-surface setups, and Adam is asking, how do you choose which surface you can connect it to? And actually, mixpad always connects to the mix rack. Yeah. So basically, it doesn't make any difference how many surfaces you have in your system. Mixpad will only connect to the mix rack. That's regardless of where it's physically patched into the network. You can choose any network socket on the system. But the actual data connection is always with the mix rack.
I mean, just to add to that as well, Azam, if, for instance, if you kind of what you're saying is you only want that mix pad to kind of affect the channels that the front of house surface is controlling, you would, of course, be able to kind of customize like a layer and just have the relevant channels visible. So, as Nick says, the mixpad application connects to the rack and so therefore has access to everything, but you can limit what's being controlled and to an extent mirror any of the surfaces.
Now, getting back to the question on AMM, Daniel is answering that question, and is saying, so one of our distributors and users is reporting back that AMM works actually very well in theater applications. So you're very welcome to try and have a play with it. What happens if multiple users are trying to save or update different scenes at the same time? Now they're thinking of every possible scenario, aren't they? But, I believe you get a busy message on the screen. Is that
yeah,
the case?
I don't think anything untoward would happen. It may be that, again, I haven't kind of tested this thoroughly myself, but I would envisage that maybe the scene store would take a little bit longer than normal, but I can't imagine that it would have any kind of untoward effects. There would probably just be a priority depending on who instigates an action first.
Well, I think we answered enough questions. There are a few more coming in. As I said, we will get back to each and every of you. We ran past the hour, so I'd just like to say thank you for joining us. I hope that was interesting and that you are as excited as we are about the new features in 1.6. So thanks again, and see you next time.